Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I have a very inspiring man with me, Jonny Huntington. Jonny is an athlete at Jonny Huntington Skiing. He's an elite para athlete, a skier, and a mountaineer. And it's a real pleasure having you on. We got connected through Kirkland. So welcome, Jonny, to the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. It's really kind of you to have me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I think I'm particularly excited about the expedition you're about to go on. So, would you tell everybody listening what is happening and the dates that you're going to be doing that?
Yeah, certainly. So, November of this year, I'm traveling down to Antarctica via Chile, and I'm looking to become the first ever disabled person to ski from it's the inner coastline of Antarctica. So it's the landmass of Antarctica, to the South Pole, solo and unsupported. Um, and just to unpack briefly what that means, it's a journey of about 911 kilometers. So there are sort of three traditional start points people use. I'm I'm doing the shortest one because I'm lazy. But I'm starting from a place called the Mesna start point, after Reinhold Messner.
Yeah.
Um, and that will be a journey of about 40 days. And the solo and unsupported sort of stipulation is such whereby I will be starting with absolutely everything I need to undertake that journey, in one sitting. So no resupplies, no caching of kit or anything like that. I'll be doing it completely alone with effectively no external help for the duration of the trip.
Wow. And of course, what you're pulling a sled
Yeah, so
with
you've
all the
got
food on it?
exactly. So I've got hopefully it's currently in transit to the UK now. I've got a 2 meter roughly long hulk, which is yeah, the sort of I believe Norwegian word for sled. And that literally contains everything that I will have for that sort of 40, 50 day period.
Yeah, and then you're digging in it. You go, "Where's that Snicker bar? Oh, yeah, I don't have a Snicker bar. I wanted a Snicker bar. It's on my mind." Um,
Yeah,
but but
everything has been extremely carefully itemized, so
I
I'm
imagined it.
losing
I
stuff.
imagine it might be Johnny, and of course, half the problem. I mean, I was just taken by Shackleton, and dragging their sleds across the ice, and then they'd meet some ridges and things like that, and you have to get it over the ridges because there's not gonna be someone going ahead of you making a nice path for you just to glide along effortlessly. It's there's going to be some shitty moments, aren't there? I mean, and you just don't know quite what you're going to face.
Yeah, I mean those ridge lines in particular are one of the kind of big features that you encounter, these sastrugi, which for those who are not familiar, they are the best way of describing them is kind of like sand dunes, but with hard packed snow and ice. So they're formed by wind, and yeah, you get these kind of 2 or 3 meter high like lumps, basically, which when you're pulling a sledge, which the starting weight of which is about 100 kilograms.
Yeah.
Um, fortunately, you don't tend to encounter them right at the start. But it becomes pretty emotional having to, sort of uphill, downhill. If you can't see, you don't know when the downhill starts, so you'll fall down. It's sort of all
And
of
then the
these.
sled runs over you.
They yes, the rope trace that I'm going to be using, the sled can get ahead of you, and they do have a bit of a mind of their own. So yeah, the definitely when I was training in Sweden this year, there were certainly instances where it felt that you were sort of fighting your own equipment as well as the as well as the environment.
Oh no, Johnny, deep respect for what you're doing, and it's a huge achievement. And who are backing you as sponsors?
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate to have some fantastic partners on this one. So the sort of primary partners I've got are Specialist Risk Group, who are a London-based insurance broker. I've got Acre Capital Real Estate, who are a London-based real estate firm. Um, Collins Aerospace, sort of large in the defence world in particular, and Team Forces, which is also one of the charities that I'm supporting. But as you've said, sort of, you and I were connected through Lamont Kirkland, the CEO of Team Forces. And they do a huge amount to further sort of not only adventurous activities but also sports within the military.
Mm.
So no, I've got a fantastic group of sort of close partners, and yeah, I think from my point of view, I mean, very very fortunate to find myself in a position where all of the businesses that I work with, not only are they extremely supportive, but I've sort of found myself in a position where everyone seems to have a very similar ethos,
Mm.
um, in terms of the general approach. And so it's a real, joy to work with these people because you never feel like there's any friction.
Yeah. Well, look, when we when this is going out, make sure in your bio you mention those different people who are sponsoring you, and also if you'd give a link for if other people wanted to continue to sponsor you and what you do, they can do that through Team Forces. So maybe give us a link on that, Jonny. But Jonny, this isn't the first crazy thing you've done, is it? You have a habit of pushing yourself to the limit. What are some of the other things that you've set out to do, whether you've succeeded or not, but you set out to?
Yeah, so I've done some sort of bits and pieces, and I mean, I suppose the first the first really long like big expedition I did was part of the Kayak for Heroes expedition back in 2021.
Hmm.
And there were five of us, all veterans injured in some way, whether it be sort of mental, physical, or both. And we kayaked the length of the UK. So kayaked from Land's End to John O'Groats. That took us what, 27 days,
Wow.
and it was a brilliant trip. And the thing that was the thing that was really interesting about that is we kind of knew how little we knew. None of us were particularly experienced paddlers. None of us had spent a massive amount of time paddling at sea. We were very fortunate to have gotten some amazing assistance by a guy called Jim Taylor Ross, who is ex-military himself, but you know, incredibly accomplished kayaker, still holds the military record for Devizes Westminster. And that was a real lesson from my point of view in terms of there is a lot of stuff which is achievable even if you are not yourself necessarily the best kayaker in the world or the best whatever in the world, but through leveraging the right level of support and really leaning into people who do know what they're doing, one can achieve an awful lot.
Yeah, and if you haven't met him, I would love you to meet John White. Do you know John?
Yeah, I know John very well. John actually, when I the next slightly sort of, well, the next long expedition I did was the following summer, so summer of 22. I ran the Southwest Coast Path. So ran it sort of, I continuously is probably misleading, but certainly ran it in one sitting.
Hmm.
And actually, John, I think it was day 3 and 4. Um, John drove me those 2 days because I was basically reliant on friends and family and all comers to provide me with sort of vehicle support, etc. And yeah, John did a couple of days of that, and that was fantastic. And we had a couple of sort of the younger paddlers, like teenage paddlers, who came and did some of the running with me. But yeah, that was a great trip for a number of reasons. But no, John was very supportive on that as well, which is great. And I mean, he and I, sort of message each other intermittently.
Good, good. Well, look, when you next message him, say I'm looking forward to having him as a guest because he's coming on soon,
Oh,
to
brilliant.
tell his story. And we met some years ago, pre-pandemic. Um, So, in all the people that you've met, that you've met a number of inspiring leaders. You say many people with a sort of like-minded philosophy. I think you talked to me about Liz and Martin. Do you want to say why you'd pick them out as a couple of inspiring leaders and what they do?
Yeah, sure. So, for context, sort of, so Liz Winfield was actually my OC when I got discharged, completely by coincidence. And I initially encountered her because I'd got in touch with one of the charities I'm supporting, which is the Armed Forces Para Snow Sport Team. When I got out of rehab, um, sort of back end of 2015, I was looking for sports that I could do and would sort of give me the same sense of freedom and adventure that I had when I was, running ultras, which I had done sort of prior to joining the army. At that stage, I was not running. I couldn't run at that point. And I'd got in touch with the Armed Forces Para Snow Sport team and said, look, I don't suppose you do cross country skiing, do you? Because I think that would be like right up my alley. And Brigadier Fred, who was the sort of founder of the charity, said to me, "This is a remarkable coincidence and great timing because we're actually in the process of running of starting to spin up our first cross country trip, and it was run by Liz, who used to, I think she managed the GB women's biathlon team. I think, maybe wrong on that one, but had done a load of biathlon with the army, and had just gotten in touch with the charity saying, any chance of doing some of this. So it was first trip was myself and Liz, and she was taking, I think, a load of her soldiers, loggies, out. Got to know her there, and then literally about 2 months later, she turned up in Aldershot in the PRU there as my OC. And sorry for those of you listening who are not sort of ex-military. PRU was the personnel recovery unit, so I was still not able to do my job properly. So I was sort of in a holding pattern really as part of the recovery unit, and the OC was the officer commanding, so typically a major, and as a young and energetic, albeit slightly limpy lieutenant at the time, sort of reported into the OC in terms of progress, etc. But so I mean, I've known Liz for, well, I mean, nearly a decade now.
Wow.
And I have never encountered anyone so busy. I've got no idea how she manages her diary. But yeah, I think and sort of similar to Martin, and I mean, not dissimilar in terms of how I met them as well. So Martin is a former one para officer who was injured himself in Afghanistan, I think around 2010. And his right arm is paralyzed. So Martin now runs a charity called the Adaptive Grand Slam. And he himself is seeking to become the first ever disabled person to complete the Explorers Grand Slam, which is the 7 summits and North and South Pole.
Wow.
So it's an incredible undertaking in and of itself. But as part of this, Martin is providing, access to the outdoors for anyone with a disability, regardless of whether they're military or otherwise. So, it is a very, very open-ended charitable remit to the Adaptive Grand Slam, which is great because from my perspective, that means that it really embodies that spirit of access. And I think that the reason from my point of view why I really admire the two of them as leaders is that everything they do is through a people-centric lens. These are people who frankly have got more than enough on their plates, but they are always primarily focused on the well-being of others. And I find myself in admiration of that sort of approach. And I've been extremely fortunate to have had a very varied career. I worked in finance before I joined the military, so I've sort of seen a decent cross section of what life is like. I mean, it also means that my CV looks like a child did it with a crayon, but that's not the point. But I've been fortunate to encounter, sort of several reasonably sort of important people in their fields, and it is the ones that I find myself gravitating towards and being drawn to the most are the ones who put others first.
Yeah. And that's just what we mean with inspiring leaders. So that is a nice segue with talking about the child with a crayon who's drawn your CV, your life story. Let's talk about that, because people are picking up that here is a man who had a brain bleed in 2014, which paralyzed half your body, left side of your body. That before you went into the military, you were already doing ultra marathons, joined the military, went through Sandhurst, joined the Adjutant General's Corps, and then had this terrible moment when everything went wrong and had to completely recalibrate your life. And here you are now going off to travel from the edge of Antarctica to the South Pole solo, unsupported and unassisted. That's a pretty remarkable kind of life. Now, I'm always interested in people's life stories, particularly in yours, Jonny. So, who influenced you as you were growing up to be the man you are today? And what are a few of the milestones, if you took just perhaps 5 minutes to take us through your life, that have brought you to today?
Yeah, so I mean, the I think probably the person who influenced me most growing up, particularly from a young age, was my mum. Um, she was a music teacher at a series of small private schools. Um, and the thing that resonated with me, even from an extremely young age, like probably before I was sort of really cognizant of what was going on, was her work ethic.
Mm.
She worked incredibly hard. She would teach peripatetically when she wasn't at school. So, we would have sort of private singing pupils in the living room first thing on Saturday morning. I'm not a morning person and never have been. And so, the some of the like Mystery, I think, from Cats is on the banned list of songs that I will not listen to because I've heard it too many times, waking me up on a Saturday morning when I should be having a lie-in. Um, but this is a woman who just did not stop, and she did it all because she wanted to provide the best education possible for me and my sister. So we were privately educated our entire sort of upbringing, and to this day, I don't really know how my mum afforded it. We were on scholarships and stuff, but it's expensive stuff. And this is a woman who was working on a teacher's salary.
Was there
So
was there a father on the scene or no father?
yeah, so my dad was on the scene. I mean, he was I would suggest, as a bit of a counterpoint, sort of never the most inspiring individual. Let's yeah, we'll leave it there. Um, but no, my mum was quite incredible in that sense, and it certainly instilled in me the value of hard work. And I think also from my perspective, it was that concept that if you took ownership for it, then you had control over stuff. You know, I I had jobs during my sort of holidays and stuff from the age of 15, sort of getting paid in cash by a restaurant because they couldn't have you on the books because technically you weren't allowed to be working.
Mm.
Um, but this from my point of view represented massive freedom because I sort of had my own little pot of money that I could spend on whatever I liked because I had earned it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a big, I don't want to say a big motivator in terms of the money itself, because obviously I wasn't earning very much. And I've never been particularly financially motivated in the sort of coldest sense of it. But it was what it enabled
Yeah.
was the thing that I loved. And I mean that certainly has been a theme throughout my entire career, is that I'm undoubtedly not in it for the money, because I certainly wouldn't be doing this if I was. Um, but if I've got enough to be sort of stable, if
Yeah.
I've got enough to keep the lights on at home, um, then that's enough for me. That's a great thing. But
And just staying with that for a moment, it's very interesting. We've got Justin Levine, who's another friend of ours, who got paralyzed at the age of 18 with a bodged hospital operation after he'd herniated a disc, and that paralyzed him from the waist downwards. But yet he's the European and UK world champion at jiu-jitsu, and
mm,
he's got his bike, which he cycled 4,000 miles across America, and we did the Ride for Unity 7 Emirates 7 days last January, and we might do again this January. But just he's a dear friend, and like you, he's generally poor as a church mouse, but he does all these things. But he and you, for me, epitomize the importance of that question: how much is enough? And how will you know when you have enough? And I meet people who are earning well over 1 million, and they go, "Well, it's never enough. Nothing's ever enough." And you go, "You're never going to be happy." Because nothing will fill the void, however much money we throw at you. Whereas I admire people like you who do phenomenal feats, and Justin, who'll do various charitable things to get by with just enough. It's never, and others would think it's hardly anything, but I just admire you for that, and I just want to acknowledge that. So thank you.
no, it's really kind of you to say, and I think that so my own take on this is that I found at the point at which I got injured, so to contextualize for your listeners, um, in 2014, I had just finished my year at Sandhurst. So I joined the British Army in 2013 as an officer, did Sandhurst, absolutely loved it. I think one encounters the spectrum of people who either love or hate Sandhurst. I had one of the best years of my life there. Had a great time. It's sort of university with guns, basically. It was awesome. Um, and I commissioned in April of 2014. And then in June of 2014, when I was in my phase 2 training with the Adjutant General's Corps in Winchester, I was training in the gym one morning, and over the course of about 15 minutes, the left side of my body just stopped working. So what it transpired later had happened is I had had a cavernous malformation, which is basically a bit of bad blood vesseling, which I, to this day cannot say without tripping over my tongue. But that had burst in the primary motor cortex and the right side of my brain. So right brain controls left body and vice versa. Um, and so yeah, I was completely paralyzed from the neck down on my left hand side. So I could still feel everything. I still had sensation, and I didn't lose consciousness. I was still awake. I was just lying on the floor of the gym, not having a fucking clue what was going on, quite frankly.
Mm.
And was lucky that my OC was with a physio across the gym. So I was able to put my working hand in the air and basically shout medic, and and the ambulance came, etc. But the thing for me, which that injury and the ensuing 2.5 years worth of physical rehab, learning to walk again, and the the psychological trauma, which I suppose after something like that, such a significantly life-changing event is probably inevitable. What all of that forced me to do to a large extent was to really pare down to a very, very basic level the stuff which was most important to me.
Mm.
And I consider myself, I would never be churlish enough to say that I was glad that my injury happened. Like, if someone could wave a wand and take it back tomorrow, I would bite their arm off for that. But it has happened. There's no reversing it, so we crack on. And the thing from my point of view, which I have derived a significant amount of benefit from since that point, is being forced into a position where I effectively had to start completely from scratch. I lost my job, I lost my hobby, and got to the point where, summer of 2016, my mental health had deteriorated to such an extent that, um, you know, basically suicide was the only thing I thought about.
Really?
And, for anyone who has not sort of, and hopefully lots of your readers have not been in that position. Oh, sorry, listeners. Fortunately, hopefully no one's been in that position before. But to analogize it in a manner which is kind of the closest thing I can think about it. When you were sort of a teenager and you like broke up with your girlfriend, or actually more specifically, she broke up with you in my case, but there you go. But for that sort of week or two afterwards, regardless of what you're doing and regardless of how focused you're trying to be, every time that you have a second in your own head, you think about that girl. Yeah, and it's that kind of mourning period for that. Summer of 2016, my brain was like that, but all I could think about was how I was going to kill myself.
Yeah.
It was a very, very dark time, and I was extremely fortunate to have friends and colleagues who were able to listen completely without judgment and just allow me to they allowed me to navigate my own way through this, but in a manner whereby I knew that I was completely supported all the time.
Yeah. So just staying with this, because this is firstly, I'm really sorry that you went through all that, and I relate to it because there was a stage in my life where I felt suicidal and thought that was the only option out. Luckily, again, help got me through it. But I know that people listening, and the forces lose a lot of ex-servicemen who take their own lives. It's a horrible statistic of a number of people every day are taking their own life who've served in the armed forces, and in America it's even bigger.
Mm.
But what would be your advice for somebody who's been through a huge trauma in their life, and they are feeling so depressed, and their mental health is under such pressure? What can they do, and what should others who have someone like that do to help that person?
I mean, it is a tremendously difficult and complex thing. And I'll address the second part of the question first, because actually that's the really difficult bit. Like, and I've been on the other side of that conversation as well. And one of the hardest things about it is that you feel completely powerless to actually do anything to help the individual, because one is acutely aware that there is nothing that you can do or say which is going to make that person feel any better.
Mm.
And that's why it's so difficult. You desperately want to help, but you are utterly unable to fix their problems for them. I
Mm.
think from my perspective, I think the most important thing that you can do at that time is to let them know that you are there for them. And whether that requires just listening, turning up at someone's house to give them a hug or whatever, let them have a bit of a cry, whatever it happens to be, just the act of being a trusted friend who will listen without any judgment and be there, sort of morally and physically for someone, I think is kind of all that anyone can do at that point.
Yeah.
You know.
And you're so right. And I think perhaps the first part of the question is a very tough one, because when you're in that place, you're not really listening to anybody else. It's not logical. It's highly emotional, and the brain is going through all sorts of issues with dealing with what's going on. And so the normal advice that people will give you, you're just not hearing, just not listening.
Precisely. And, from my perspective, sort of, I suppose the best cure is prevention,
Yeah.
in the sense that one of the things which I am very keen to highlight on the back of the expedition and such that I'm doing is that personally, I feel mental health is something which is currently only really addressed at the point at which it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And I think from my point of view, the analogy I always make is that if you are physically unwell, you go and see a doctor. Okay. But the reason why we all, particularly these days, increasingly so, try to keep ourselves fit and healthy by going to a gym or going running or whatever it, one's preferred medium happens to be, the point of going to see a personal trainer is to keep yourself out of the doctor's office.
Mm.
And one of the things which is really, really important to me is trying to change attitudes to a certain extent towards mental health so that it's viewed in the same way as physical health. We should not be putting people in a situation where they have to seek clinical help, because we should be enabling people to have strategies and tactics in place which prevent them from getting there in the first place.
Exactly. And if we've got, as I know, someone who's been through a terrible trauma, my advice to them was, one, do things that bring you joy. Two, get back to doing the physical exercise you used to be doing that you stopped doing, and spend time with family and friends. Those are just some of the things early on before it becomes a problem and they slip into depression, and then it's a downward spiral down the plug hole. Would you say that makes sense from your experience?
I mean, yes, absolutely. I think the things that you've said there are I think they work. I think that there are a plethora of scientific studies supporting the fact that exercise causes dopamine release, which obviously makes you happy or happier. And similarly, spending time with families and friends, being intimate, etc. All of these cure depression at a chemical level.
Mm.
Having said all of that, I think that the difficulty around mental health, it is specifically individual, and particularly when one has suffered a significantly traumatic episode.
Mm. Mm.
It's kind of one of those ones where all bets are off.
Yeah.
Because there is no prescriptive answer to it.
Yeah.
And I think that as sort of harsh as it sounds, in my experience of this, and please, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I certainly don't have all the answers here. But in my experience of it, it was a case of navigating my own way out of it. And a big part of that was forcing myself to effectively rationalize my way out of it.
Mm.
And the reason I say that's very personal is that, like, I am, as an example, I am a reasonably like hardline atheist. So from my point of view, suicide was an extremely irrational act, because I knew that that was that is a definitive endpoint. So from my perspective, it therefore represented something which was inherently quite selfish.
Mm.
It also meant it was very antithetical to my own system of values. You know, I joined the army ultimately to help people who couldn't help themselves.
Mm.
And if I had let my own mental health issues overcome me, then I had certainly would have failed in doing that.
That is very powerful as almost a credo, if the Americans were to call it, but also it links to the first two elements of the Inspiring Leadership Compass that you and I have talked about. In fact, the first three, which is your moral quotient, your sense of meaning and purpose, and the legacy you want to leave. Those three we find is part of the 8 points of the compass, but they're almost like in a Norman arch of a church. Those three keystones are crucial to the whole archway staying up. And the more pressure they're under, and the clearer you are with them, the more it'll make the structure solid. So let's just play with those three, because I think they're very interesting. Your moral question, your values and beliefs, what you will and won't do, Jonny. How has that helped you, and what advice would you give to people about the importance of being clear on your moral values and your principles and your integrity?
Yeah. So from my point of view, I do very much see one's values and ethics as a bedrock. You know, from my own perspective, I was extremely fortunate having just come out of Sandhurst. You know, anyone who's been through a military institution will know firsthand. But when you join up to these things, the values and standards are drilled into you from day one. To the extent that, you know, sea drills, I think probably anyone who's ever served in the British Army will be familiar with sea drills. And it's, you know, it is the acronym for the values and standards of the British Army. And, you know, you can rattle them off in the same manner that you can rattle off your service number.
Go on then.
You know,
Rattle them off.
so it's just, I'm going to get them wrong now, aren't I?
Don't worry, don't worry. No,
Courage,
it's not a test.
courage, determination, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, selfless commitment. There you go.
Wow.
And, you know, as I say, I strongly suspect that anyone, certainly who's ever been through Sandhurst, which is my experience of it, could probably do that after 10 pints as well. You know, not that I'd be awake these days to do it at that stage, but hey ho. But no, I was extremely fortunate at the point at which I got injured that they were still very much at the forefront of my mind. And I found when I joined the army that the values and standards really resonated with me. You know, these were things which I genuinely aspired to uphold. And I mean, to a certain extent, even now, you know, sort of people inevitably sort of say, "Oh, what values do you espouse?" And you know, one always feels A, slightly lazy, and B, slightly sort of cliched by just rattling off sea drills again. I think that the one which and this was sort of always talked about even at the time, the one I feel is missing is humility.
Yes.
And we won't dive into discussion about why that may or may not be an appropriate value for a British Army officer to have. But it was always sort of the seventh unspoken one. I sort of feel now that it's probably the most important one that I have leveraged on a daily basis since then, because, you know, I'm about to go and do something which I haven't experienced before to the extent I'm going to. And during this process, and, you know, I've been pretty obsessive about the South Pole for the last sort of 5 years. And during this process, one encounters a wide variety, albeit a small number, of people who have done it. And they tend to, in my experience, fall into one of two camps when you speak to them. Either they have done it and they know all of the answers and they will tell you exactly how you ought to do it. Or you'll encounter people who have done it and they will really, really happily talk to you about what worked for them and listen to your ideas, and you'll have a dialogue about, oh, I was thinking about this and I don't know if it'll work properly, but what do you think of this? And, you know, and they won't tell you anything unless you ask for it specifically, but they'll give you what worked for them.
Yes, and that for me is an inspiring leader, because it's the what we call the three hums: humility, humanity, and a nice sense of humor, self-deprecating humor.
Yeah,
It's very much
exactly.
the British Army officer approach. And the other one is from my friend Jeff Nishwitz, who said 10 words, 3 phrases that are very important. 1, I was wrong. 2, I don't know. And 3, I need some help. And
Yeah.
if you can say those 3 things, that for me is the finest of the inspiring leaders, who are prepared to have the amount of humility to be vulnerable which is actually a strength. But if you're certain politicians, which I won't name on this program, both American and British, who cannot admit to any of those, they are never wrong, they never apologize, and they never ask for any help because they think they can do it all themselves, and they think they know it all, and then that's when you got a problem. That's when
Is it?
people die.
Yeah, it's sort of the classic politician's apology, isn't it? Sort of, oh, I'm sorry that you feel that way. It's sort
Yeah.
of this slap in the face of,
I
well,
hear what I
I'm
hear
happy
what
to
you
apologize.
say, which means they're not listening at all. I hate that one. I hear what you say.
Yeah, I mean,
Very patronizing.
I I do really like what you've said there in terms of sort of those three steps, because I frequently find myself wrong or not knowing or needing help.
Yeah.
And the thing that I certainly have probably probably grown into a bit more as I've gotten a bit older. And it was, I joined Sandhurst quite old to be there. I was 27 when I joined.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, so hence why certain sort of
You
career
must have been
paths.
you must have been close to the limit, were you?
I was at the limit. Yeah, so it was hence why certain career paths were closed off to me at that point, which from my point of view is a shame, but it didn't stop me potentially pursuing what I wanted to. A massive stroke did that. But no, it was very notable that because I had turned up a little bit older, I was quite questioning and not afraid to ask questions, um, because I knew that I didn't know stuff. I
Yeah.
had never done anything military before, and I understood that in order to be effective at my job, I needed to understand the stuff that I was being asked to do.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I say this with no disrespect to anyone in particular, but like it was notable that certainly some of the younger guys um were less confident in terms of asking questions, because I assume in part, I obviously part of it is because they wanted to get to lunch, which that's entirely reasonable. But I suspect a significant part of it is because they didn't want to appear ignorant in front of their colleagues.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and but there's I I don't I understand the psychology of that,
Yeah.
but I also at the same time I find it very difficult to reconcile um, a sort of refusal to be wrong or not know something
Mm.
because it's antithetical to actually learning.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good challenge to them. And why do that? So we've just covered very nicely moral integrity and the values and ethics as a bedrock. And then the next one round the compass is, and we're not going to get a chance because we haven't got that much longer to go all the way around, but I think I want to just touch on purpose and legacy. So purpose, as you were discussing it with me earlier, when you had this huge moment in your life with the brain bleed and you were paralyzed down one side, your life purpose and what gave your life meaning and this course that you had and everything that was planned suddenly was thrown off. You were thrown way off purpose and you had to come back on and design a new purpose. So to you and sharing with those listening, how important to you and others do you think getting a clear purpose and staying on purpose and having to adjust your life purpose is?
So personally, I think it's absolutely critical. I think that um, one of the key reasons why I found myself in such mental turmoil was that I felt I had lost my sense of purpose. What I will say about that is that actually I hadn't at all, and I now still operate with the same purpose that I did before I joined the army. However, I was too deep in the weeds of it at the time to appreciate that actually the purpose remained exactly the same, and nothing that had happened to me would stop me from fulfilling that purpose. What had changed was that I was no longer able to do it through the mechanism that I intended to.
Mm.
And I think that's really crucial for everyone to understand. Um,
It
in
was almost in a way your why was very clear. You had a clear burning
Yeah,
why, but it was your how had to change.
exactly, but it also puts it into context that um the how is relatively unimportant, you know.
Mm.
And I don't say completely unimportant, like it's, I do what I do now because it's something that I'm good at and something I enjoy doing.
Mm.
um, I could quite happily fulfill that purpose, of helping others who can't help themselves, could quite happily fulfill that through any number of mechanisms. Yeah,
Mm.
any number of jobs, any number of charitable activities, whatever. Okay. The thing from my point of view, which was so jarring about the point at which you got injured, was that injury meant that I couldn't do my job anymore. So that is unusual in the sense that there aren't many jobs where there are physical criteria.
Mm.
Um, but what has been very reassuring since then is that that sense of purpose hasn't really changed very much.
Mm.
Ultimately, it's still about helping others in the broadest possible sense. And I think it's sort of it is the certainly in my own case, the aspiration of the young man or young person to sort of want to cure the world's ills.
Yeah.
Whereas from my perspective now, slightly older, a bit more perspective, I kind of realized that actually, if I can help a decent set of people, then that's not a bad thing. So I think my own personal aspiration has sort of tempered slightly from trying to want to be, everything to everyone, um, to kind of saying actually there's, let's see what we think's achievable and go from there.
Yeah, it's really interesting because for various reasons, I know I now have a finite amount of time to live. And that's got my mind very focused on in my work with CEOs and teams. How can I help develop inspiring leadership and inspiring leaders among them so they influence positively the largest number of people in business? And I am very motivated that that will positively change the lives of people I may never meet. And
Mm,
that somehow, it's a strange thing, but it's somehow hugely motivating. Just a session with 100 leaders last week in Germany, their top 100 leaders of big multinational company. I know they'll go out and change the lives of people I will never get to meet. And
mm.
that is a legacy, which takes me on to your legacy. What would you like your legacy to be, Jonny?
I mean, it, ultimately, from my point of view, exactly as I say, if I depart the world having left it a slightly better place than I found it, then that's great. Like that's the point ultimately, isn't it? You
Yeah.
know, I kind of I flatter myself. I had when I was at Sandhurst, you are told to decorate your bedroom after week 5, and yeah, being a bit, I had departed from the slightly university bedsit style, put posters of Carmen Electra and stuff up. So I bought myself sort of 4 rather modest, sort of A3 sized pictures that I liked, rather than something which, the adjutant sort of said, "Oh, Mr. Huntington, this is a slightly boring room." So I'm not being funny, sir, but I'm 27 years old. If I need to demonstrate charisma by putting photos on the wall, then hey ho.
Yeah.
But one of the prints I bought was of the I think it's the London Herald, the day that Roger Bannister broke the 4 minute mile, you know, and because it's something that for me, that's a beautiful example of something which like you had doctors saying if he does it, his heart will explode. Like this was something considered humanly impossible.
Yeah.
And after Bannister did it, it was then broken multiple times within the 12 months prior, or sorry, the 12 months after. So I just think it's a lovely demonstration of the power that one person believing in something thought to be impossible, like what can follow on from something like that,
Yeah.
I think is incredible. And for me, although I wouldn't flatter myself to consider myself in the same sort of sentence as Bannister, like if what I do can have some similar effect
Mm.
within a community of people that can identify with me, then for me, that I mean that's the gold standard, really. That's everything I could dream of achieving.
And you will. Your personal example to those who have disability will be inspirational. I mean, it's inspirational to me. And I think to those listening, and we just wish you every success with that. And just thinking of this huge physical and mental feat you're going to undertake from Antarctica to the South Pole. You said before you joined the army that you had already done ultra marathons. Fitness and health is clearly important to you, and you also said that your way of training for this, because you're going to you're going to strip off a lot of fat. You're going to, I think poor old, um, I've forgotten her name, but there's a girl rowing across the Atlantic.
Zara.
Zara, thank you. Mental blank, senior moment. Zara was saying that her weight's going to drop right down. So she's having to eat huge amounts because of what she's going to use up. You, with particularly with the cold as well, are going to lose a lot of weight. And so you're going to have to build up. But you have to do the work of both this simultaneous work of an endurance athlete and a power lifter. But yet before you were an ultra runner. So just tell us a bit about what drives you and what your tip is about fitness.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of what drives me, like I really do like doing this stuff, and I appreciate it. Like type two fun is always this slightly perverse environment. It's kind of like, and again, for those listening who don't haven't encountered type two fun, it's that kind of delayed response fun. It's sort of, you run a marathon, the whole thing's grim, but then you finish and actually you reflect on it and it was really worthwhile, and you may not have necessarily enjoyed every moment of it, but you're pleased you did it. That's kind of how I define type two. um these expeditions, there is a there is a subcategory of type 2 fun referred to as type 3, which is sort of something so horrible that it can change you physically and mentally for life and etc. So I'm hoping that this exped doesn't fall into type 3. But no, I mean, as I said previously, sort of from my point of view, it's the perfect storm of something which I'm quite good at, and I genuinely do quite enjoy. And I sort of, on the flip side of that coin, I'm pretty crap at most other things. Like sitting in an office is not the thing for me. So, from my point of view, is how can I provide something which, hopefully does sort of whether inspire people or encourage people, or however, at a scale which is sort of effective, because otherwise I may as well just walk around my town speaking to people who are having bad days. Um, you know, and doing something which at the same time motivates me enough to
Mm,
keep me doing it for the long term.
yeah.
And I think from my point of view, I have found that sweet spot, but at the same time, I've also, I've had to work for it. Like, I run this as a business, I run my own company, and I'll be honest, I think I believe I'm right in saying that, like, prior to me, like, disabled polar explorers not a proper job. You know, but it again, it's that sort of thing. I got dropped from the GB team for cross country skiing in 2019, completely rightly so. I was never going to make Paralympics. I was too slow, um, and a plethora of other excuses which I won't go into now. But at that point in time, there was a decision to be made as to, do I continue to, ski for fun when I can afford it, and it's now a hobby. It's nothing more than a hobby. Or do I work out how to make this thing that I really love work for me? And I think that is something which I would certainly give as advice, probably not to, CEOs, to be fair, because they will know this better than I do, but certainly as someone who has been institutionalized within the civil service for most of his adult life, um, branching out on an entrepreneurial path was terrifying. Like I didn't know for a while that I was going to be able to pay the mortgage throughout the whole of this trip, and there were loads of unknowns, all of which previously were just dead certs, you know, and that stuff for me is much more scary than a long cold walk ultimately. So I kind of I think one of the things that I would say about this whole journey from my point of view is that it has been incredibly educational for me, utterly terrifying at the same time. But I have always had a plan in place, and I have always known what I wanted the outcomes to be. And sorry, I appreciate that sort of doesn't relate particularly to fitness per se, but I do think there are all sorts of people who potentially wish that their professions and their passions aligned more.
Mm, mm.
And certainly in terms of my journey into sport, like I have had to make it work,
Yeah.
and I do think there's a lot to be said for for anyone who has not just the drive, because only drive is just pipe dreams. That's not a reality. But if you've got the ambition and you've got a plan in place as to how you're going to succeed, all the basics, cash flow through a business, how you're going to generate value for your clients, etc. Like that's the point at which you start going from, oh, yeah, that would be nice to, oh, hang on a minute, this is actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's truly inspiring, and I am very excited for what you're doing. And really, makes me think each day, if I ever have a bad day, I think, well, what's Jonny doing?
Ah, thank you, mate. That's very kind of you. Can
So,
I do,
Jonny,
sorry,
let's,
Jonathan, just before we move on quickly, can I do a fitness tip as well? Because I've got one really good one.
yep, far away.
There was a large cohort study run in Sweden, yeah, over 1,000 participants, etc., amongst office workers. Yeah, and this is why I really like this one, because this is general populace. Okay, they found a distinct break point at a VO2 max of 44, which is pretty much average for an adult. It's just on the good side of average for an adult. Okay. And they found that above that break point, so anyone with a VO2 max higher than 44 demonstrated a significant, i.e., a statistically significant, better improvement in cognitive function.
Wow. Yep.
So for anyone out there who wonders whether it's worth, doing cardiovascular exercise, yes, it has been demonstrated that it makes you think better.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Which brings us nicely to the end of the 2-minute top tip. So, would you, Jonny, say your name, because this stands in its own right, your name, whether you describe yourself as disabled polar explorer or the other bits as well. Just tell us what you're doing at the moment, and particularly the expedition you're about to go on, and share with us your top tip, and that will bring us nicely to a close.
Sure. So I'm Jonny Huntington. I am a disabled polar explorer, endurance athlete, general cad about town. And I'm November of this year, I'm going to embark on an expedition in Antarctica to become the first ever disabled person to ski from the edge of the continent to the South Pole, solo and unsupported. And what's my top tip going to be, do I think? This is a difficult one because there is a lot that goes into this stuff. So, okay, I think for this one, Jonathan, I think my top tip is going to be have big ambition,
Mm-hmm.
and know what it is you want to achieve. but have a plan in place in terms of how you are going to get from where you are now to where it is you want to be. Because without that plan, that ambition is only ambition.
That's a really clear one. I know lots of people have great ambitions, but everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth, as Mike Tyson would say, and have a plan. And because no plan survives the first meeting with the enemy. Jonny, it's been fabulous having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. I've really enjoyed it. We all wish you every success in your amazing feat across Antarctica to the South Pole. And we will be following you and encouraging you. And we can follow you, I assume, on Team Force's site. Will that be tracking how you're getting on?
So hopefully the Team Forces site will, to a certain extent. The best place to sort of follow along on a blow by blow account of the journey will be, so I'm on Instagram, which is at Jonny Huntington, nice and straightforward, mainly so I don't forget it. I'm also on LinkedIn, again, Jonny Huntington, and I've got a website which I always forget what it actually is. I think it's johnnyhuntingtonskiing.com.
Don't worry, we'll put it in your notes.
Yeah, I'll send you a link.
Add it there, because I can't remember it as a dyslexic. But
yeah.
Jonny, really great having you on, and thank you very much for your time.
I really appreciate it, Jonathan. Thanks very much for having me. Great to talk.